Hello everyone, you are on my channel, where you will find forbidden BL stories that you won't be able to take your eyes off of. This is the story of an Omega who took a job in a widowed Alpha's house, only to learn that his scent is almost identical to the partner the Alpha buried, and the children fall for him far too fast. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and subscribe so you don't miss new forbidden BL stories. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Evan had learned to survive in a way that left no fingerprints. He kept his world small on purpose, the same backstreets, the same late shifts, the same corner shops where nobody cared enough to ask questions. He stayed ahead of trouble by being forgettable. He kept his Omega status contained with suppressants he rationed like food, because stability cost money, and money had never stayed with him for long. He took work that was practical, not dignified. Stock rooms, night cleaning, quiet service jobs where supervisors only noticed you when something went wrong. The kind of places where alphas walked past too close, noses flaring for half a second, and Evan lowered his gaze like an apology for existing. He had learned that an Omega without an anchor was treated like a liability, something that might disrupt the order just by breathing. The agency listing looked almost gentle when it hit his inbox. Live-in caretaker, 2 children, quiet estate outside the city, high pay. Strict confidentiality. The email was written in soft corporate language, the kind meant to calm people who knew they were walking into someone else's power. The pay number was high enough to make Evan's throat tighten, not rich, not life-changing forever, but enough to buy time. Enough to stop calculating meals like doses, enough to let him keep his suppressants consistent for once. He told himself it would be 1 year. 1 year inside someone else's rules, 1 year of boundaries and silence, and then he could leave with savings and a fresh start. He repeated that to himself as if repetition could turn it into a guarantee. The car the agency sent was clean and quiet, the driver professional to the point of invisibility. Evan watched the city fall away through tinted glass, replaced by taller trees and longer roads. The air changed, less exhaust, more cold pine, the kind of quiet that only existed where money kept distance as a lifestyle. When the car stopped at the gate, Evan's first thought was that he had come to the wrong address. The property looked like the kind of place that appeared in glossy magazines, photographed at angles that made the world seem simpler than it was. Stone steps, trim hedges cut into neat geometry, a lake behind dark pines, the surface catching a pale ribbon of light. Even the driveway felt deliberate, like it had been designed to slow people down before they reached the front door. Evan stepped out and pulled his coat tighter, not because he was cold, but because his body had gone alert in that instinctive Omega way. Big spaces made him uneasy. Big spaces meant big owners. Big owners meant big consequences. The front door opened before he could knock. A staff member in neutral uniform greeted him with polite efficiency and ushered him inside. The foyer was wide and quiet, the kind of quiet that held its breath. Evan's shoes made a soft sound on polished stone that felt too loud, like the house resented being reminded that someone new existed in it. Then he smelled it. It was faint. So faint he might have imagined it if his body hadn't responded first. Cedar, warm linen, and a trace of winter smoke, the way a jacket smelled after being near a fireplace for hours. The scent wasn't fresh. It lived in the walls, in fabric, in old air trapped behind closed doors. It belonged to someone who had once been here so completely that even absence still carried their shape. Evan's glands prickled in confusion. His suppressants were working, but not perfectly. And something about that lingering scent slid under the chemical barrier like a memory he had never owned. His breath hitched. For a second, he felt the disorienting certainty that he had stepped into a life already in progress, a story that had started long before he arrived. The staff member led him past a sitting room where furniture was arranged like a display rather than a place where people relaxed. No scattered toys, no casual clutter, no signs of children's chaos, only careful order. It looked less like a home and more like a museum built around grief. At the base of a broad staircase, Evan finally saw him. Adrian Hale stood at the top landing, tall and controlled, dressed in dark clothes that fit like armor. He held himself with the discipline of someone who had survived a collapse by turning himself into structure. His face was calm in a practiced way, but the calm did not reach his eyes. His eyes looked like they had learned how to stop expecting anything good. Evan remembered what the agency had said. Widowed alpha. Minimal interaction, routine and boundaries. The words had sounded harmless on a phone call. Now, seeing Adrian in person, Evan understood that those boundaries were not just preference. They were survival. Adrian's gaze dropped to Evan and stayed there a beat too long. Not in the way hungry alphas looked at omegas, not like appetite. More like a fracture, like recognition that didn't make sense. Adrian inhaled once, shallow and controlled, and his posture shifted by a fraction. His jaw tightened. His fingers, resting on the banister, flexed as if he had grabbed onto something invisible. Evan felt it like a cold wave. The alpha's composure didn't soften, it didn't warm. It cracked in the smallest, most dangerous way. Evan's instinct screamed at him to shrink, to hide his scent deeper. He forced his shoulders down, forced his expression neutral, forced his breathing steady. "I'm just staff," he reminded himself silently. "I'm just passing through." Adrian didn't move down the stairs. He didn't offer a welcoming gesture. He simply stood as if the space between them had turned sharp, as if stepping closer might do damage he couldn't undo. Evan was about to follow the staff member toward the hallway when he heard small footsteps, fast and light, cutting through the heavy silence like a thrown stone. Two children appeared at the edge of the foyer. A boy and a girl, both too still the moment they saw Evan, as if their bodies had decided something before their minds could catch up. The boy's eyes widened, not with curiosity, but with shock. The girl's face twisted with a brief flash of confusion, then something that looked dangerously like hope. They stared at Evan as if he had stepped out of a picture they weren't supposed to look at anymore, as if they had been told not to expect him, and yet their grief had never stopped expecting someone. The girl took a tiny step forward, then froze. Her lips parted on a sound that didn't become a word. The boy's hands clenched at his sides, like he was bracing for the moment Evan vanished again. Evan's chest tightened. He didn't know the dead man's name. He didn't know the story. He didn't know what loss had done to this house. But he understood, with a sick clarity, that the children had recognized something in him that he couldn't control. His scent, muted by suppressants, still carried a note that matched the ghost living in the walls. Adrian's eyes flicked to the children and back to Evan. The tension in his face sharpened into something almost angry, not at Evan, but at the cruel coincidence of it. His throat moved as if he swallowed something bitter. A short, raw sound escaped him, not quite a word, more like a breath that hurt. No, it wasn't a command. It was a protest. The girl's eyes filled instantly, the way children's eyes did when they were trying not to cry and failing. The boy's gaze turned wary, as if he was afraid that hope itself was a trap. Evan stood in the center of the foyer, feeling suddenly like his body didn't belong solely to him, like he had walked into someone else's memory wearing his skin, carrying a scent that had no right to exist on him. He forced himself to speak quietly, carefully, because the air felt fragile. "I'm here to work." The staff member shifted, uncertain, as if realizing too late what they had brought into the house. Adrian's expression smoothed again, but the damage was already done. The first crack had opened, and cracks never stayed small in places built on restraint. Evan looked at the children one more time and felt something twist inside him, half pity, half fear. This job was not going to be about cleaning floors or preparing meals. This house had been waiting for a ghost, and Evan had arrived with a scent that could wake it up. The contract waited for Evan in a folder, the color of winter clouds, placed on a table that looked too expensive to touch. The house manager, a woman with calm eyes and a voice trained to sound neutral in every situation, slid it toward him with the careful politeness of someone delivering medicine. It was thick, too thick for a job that should have been laundry schedules and school pickups. The pages smelled faintly of new ink and old caution. Evan skimmed the first section and felt his shoulders tighten almost immediately. This was not only employment, this was containment, written in professional language. He was not a guest, not family, not a companion, not a friend of the children. He was staff, and the contract repeated it like a ritual. The words appeared in different forms again and again, as if the paper itself feared blur. Evan would live in the East Wing. Evan would use the service stairs. Evan would not enter the master suite under any circumstances. Evan would not remain alone with the children in any unsecured area without notifying the household schedule. Evan would keep his phone away from the children and never photograph them, never record their voices, never share the layout of the property. No visitors, no deliveries without screening, no personal social media posts with identifiable location tags, no contact with press, no interviews, no human interest stories. The house was not just private, it was fortified by reputation. Most of that made sense in a wealthy home. Evan had worked enough high-end jobs to recognize the usual paranoia. But the deeper he read, the more the contract stopped sounding like privacy and started sounding like fear with a lawyer's vocabulary. A section titled Wellness Compliance appeared near the middle, framed in language so careful it felt like a trap. It covered scent management. Evan was required to maintain suppressants at a schedule approved by the house physician. He was required to avoid omega heat triggers, including certain foods, certain medications, certain stressors, certain environmental conditions. If he experienced any instability, any gland sensitivity, any spike in pheromone output, he was to report it immediately, before it became noticeable. The words were clinical, but Evan could read the panic beneath them. Someone here was terrified of what an omega body could awaken. His pen hovered over the signature line. For a second, his pride tried to flare. He wasn't a weapon. He wasn't a problem. He was a person who needed work. But pride did not pay rent. Pride did not keep suppressants stocked. Pride did not protect an omega alone in a world that treated him like a fault line. He signed. The house manager didn't look relieved. She looked as if she had simply completed the first step in a long procedure. His first full day began like an assessment. Not hostile, not cruel, just structured in a way that made Evan feel like his presence was being measured for risk. He was walked through the routines: morning kitchen protocol, allergy lists, school drop times, after-school tutoring, approved snacks, forbidden snacks, approved routes through the estate, and the security codes that would unlock certain doors while leaving others sealed. Every hallway felt curated, as if grief had been turned into architecture. The walls were painted in soft, neutral tones that should have felt calming, but instead felt like silence made visible. There were no family photographs in the open, no candid frames, no messy evidence that the house had ever been happy in a careless way. The air carried the faint scent Evan had noticed on arrival, trapped deep in fabric and wood, not fresh but persistent, like a perfume that refused to fade. He met the children properly in the kitchen, where sunlight hit the counters and tried to make the space feel normal. Nora stood close enough that Evan could feel her watchfulness like a hand on his sleeve. She held a stuffed rabbit with a worn ear, the kind of toy that had been hugged through too many nights. Leo hovered near the pantry door, shoulders angled as if he needed a wall at his back. He studied Evan's hands more than his face, as if deciding whether those hands would ever become dangerous. They weren't rude. They weren't even particularly demanding. They were desperate. Evan recognized that hunger immediately, because it was the same hunger he had carried through his own life. The hunger for someone predictable, someone who stayed, someone whose presence didn't come with a price paid later. The house manager introduced Evan in a voice that kept him safely categorized: caretaker, household support, a helper. Not a replacement, not an attachment, not a person the children should cling to. The words were careful, but the children's bodies didn't follow language. Their nervous systems followed scent and routine, followed the soft gravity of someone new who arrived and did not immediately leave. Nora tilted her head slightly, as if trying to identify something she couldn't name. Leo's eyes narrowed, not in aggression, but in fear that hope could make him stupid. Evan kept his distance. He smiled softly without pushing it. He spoke only when necessary. He reminded himself that boundaries weren't cruelty. Boundaries were safety. By afternoon, the first slip happened. Evan passed the small family sitting room while carrying folded linens and noticed a corner of a frame turned face down on the shelf. Next to it was a candle, half melted and uneven, as if someone had lit it in shaking hands and forgotten to blow it out. The room smelled stronger than the rest of the house: the cedar, the warm linen, the trace of winter smoke. It clung to the upholstery and the curtains like a living thing. Evan's glands flared in response, sharp and involuntary. He stopped mid-step, pulse jumping, and pressed his palm against his throat as if he could physically push his biology back into place. Suppressants weren't meant to fail like this. They weren't meant to react to a scent that wasn't even present, only remembered. And yet his body responded like it had been called by name. "Not now," he breathed, the words escaping before he could catch them. He forced himself to move again, shoulders stiff, face composed. He washed his hands longer than necessary at the kitchen sink, as if water could rinse the reaction away. He checked his patch, pressed it down harder, swallowed an extra stabilizer from his own supply, even though it meant he would have fewer later. That evening, after the children were in bed and the staff had retreated into their quiet routines, Evan returned to the East Wing and found a physician's kit already placed on his dresser. Vitamins, omega stabilizers, a sealed suppressant patch of higher grade than the ones he could afford, a small card with dosage instructions written in neat, impersonal handwriting. No greeting, no reassurance. Just a plan. The message was clear without a single spoken word. The house was watching his biology as closely as his behavior. Evan sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the kit for a long time, his stomach twisted with something like humiliation. He understood why. He understood the risk. But being monitored like a chemical variable made him feel less like a person and more like a potential disaster being managed. He lay down that night fully dressed, too restless to bother with comfort. The estate's quiet pressed against the windows. Somewhere far down a corridor a floorboard creaked, the soft complaint of old wood settling. But Evan knew the difference between a house settling and grief moving through space. He stared into the dark and let the truth form fully in his mind for the first time. He hadn't been hired only because he was competent. He had been hired because he solved a problem no one wanted to name. And in a house built on unnamed problems, nothing stayed soft for long. By the third day, Evan could tell the children were building a map of him with the precision of survival, not with polite curiosity, not with the slow warming most kids needed with new staff, but with the urgent intensity of people who had already learned what absence felt like. They measured him in routines, in consistency, in the smallest shifts of tone that adults assumed children never noticed. Nora began leaving offerings the way children did when they had no other language for fear. A folded drawing appeared on Evan's breakfast tray, the paper creased into neat quarters as if she had rehearsed the act of giving it. The picture showed a house under a large sun and 3 stick figures holding hands. One of the figures had hair drawn too long, like she was trying to rebuild someone from memory, but couldn't remember the exact shape. The next morning, a flower lay outside Evan's door, freshly picked, its stem snapped unevenly in haste. Then a note, written in careful block letters, heavy with concentration. "Please stay." Evan held that note longer than he should have. It weighed more than paper. It felt like a child pressing a palm against a door that had been slammed too many times. He placed it back where he found it, as if returning it could keep it from becoming a promise he had no right to make. Leo moved differently. He did not offer gifts. He did not ask for attention. He tested. He watched Evan's hands when he poured juice, tracking whether the movement was steady or impatient. He watched Evan's eyes when bedtime came up, as if gauging whether Evan's care would turn sharp the moment the house got quiet. He hovered near doorways like he needed an exit route, and when Adrian's footsteps sounded in the hall, Leo's shoulders rose and locked, his gaze cutting to Evan like a silent question. "Will you change too?" Leo had learned that love could vanish without warning. So he tried to prove it wasn't real before it could leave again. Evan understood that instinct better than he wanted to. He had lived it. He had been the one who stayed too long in places that hurt, because leaving felt like death. He refused to let himself become another adult who made the children's hope into a weakness. He kept the boundaries clean the way the contract demanded and the way his conscience begged. He did not hug. He did not scoop them into his arms when they leaned toward him. He did not call them sweet names. He did not step into the role their grief tried to shove onto him. He simply showed up. Breakfast at the same time. The same bowl for Nora, the same spoon for Leo, the same gentle correction when Leo tried to skip food as punishment for the world. Laundry folded without complaint. Shoes lined by the door the way Adrian insisted, even when the children kicked them off in a mess of frustration. Stories read in a calm tone when nightmares pulled them out of sleep. Evan became a metronome in a house where everyone else moved around the beat. It should have been enough. It should have been safe. But scent was a language kids understood before words. It lived deeper than manners and rules. Evan's suppressants muted his Omega presence, but they did not erase it, and whatever similarity existed between him and the dead Omega of this house slipped through every chemical barrier like smoke under a door. The first moment Evan truly realized that came during a sudden afternoon storm. The sky dimmed without warning, turning the tall windows gray. Thunder rolled over the lake like something heavy being dragged across the earth. Nora startled at the first crack, her body jolting as if her nerves had already been primed for disaster. She ran into the hallway without thinking, barefoot, hair messy, rabbit clutched to her chest. Evan stepped forward instinctively, then stopped himself halfway. Boundaries, he reminded himself, distance, structure. Nora didn't ask permission. She simply pressed her small face into his sweater and inhaled like she was drowning and he was air. Evan froze, muscles locking, heart slamming once hard enough to make him dizzy. He felt her shoulders loosen, felt her breathing slow as if some invisible knot had finally released. She whispered something so small it barely existed. "Don't go." Evan's throat tightened. He did not hug her. He did not wrap his arms around her and complete the picture her grief wanted. He only lowered himself to one knee so he wasn't towering over her, and he kept his voice steady as if steadiness could save them both. "I'm here," he said, and hated himself for how much that sounded like a promise. Leo stood at the end of the hallway and watched the entire scene with eyes too sharp for a child. He didn't look jealous. He looked terrified, as if he had just witnessed the beginning of something that could either heal them or break them worse. After the storm passed, Nora acted as if nothing had happened. Children were like that. Their bodies made choices their minds couldn't explain, and then their minds pretended it was normal. She returned to her schoolwork, her coloring, her routine. But she kept drifting closer to Evan all evening, her gaze flicking to him the way a person checked for the location of a fire exit. Leo grew quieter. He stayed near the pantry door at dinner, posture rigid, eyes tracking Evan with a strange vigilance. When Evan rose to clear plates, Leo's gaze followed his hands. When Evan spoke softly to the house manager, Leo listened for the hidden edge in Evan's tone. He was collecting evidence. Late that night, Evan woke to a faint sound he couldn't name. Not a cry, not a call, just the soft friction of fabric against floor. He opened his door and found Leo sitting outside in the dim hall, knees hugged to his chest, head tipped forward. The boy had not knocked. He had not asked. He had simply come to the only place in the house where his nervous system stopped vibrating. Evan's first instinct was panic. The contract. The boundaries. The warnings. His second instinct was older and truer. No child sat like that unless something inside them was shaking apart. Evan sat down 2 steps away, keeping space, keeping his hands to himself. He did not touch. He did not speak much. He only stayed, breathing slowly, letting his calm fill the hall the way a nightlight filled a room. After a long time, Leo's shoulders lowered by a fraction. His breathing shifted from shallow to something closer to sleep. In the dark, Leo murmured a single sentence, thin and raw. "You smell like home." Evan felt the words hit him like a bruise. He swallowed hard, staring at the wallpaper, at the floor, at anything except the child's face. "I'm not," he started, then stopped. "Not what? Not him, not the dead, not a replacement, not a promise." The truth was too complicated for a hallway at midnight, so he said the only thing he could say without lying. "You're safe right now." Leo's eyelids fluttered. After another long stretch of quiet, the boy stood and padded back toward his room without looking back. Evan stayed seated until he heard the door close, gentle, as if even the child was afraid of making noise in a house that held grief like glass. When Evan finally returned to his own bed, he felt the weight of what had happened settle fully into his bones. This was not ordinary attachment. This was imprinting born out of loss and scent association. It was fast, fierce, and fragile. And if Evan broke it, the children would break with it. Adrian noticed. Of course he did. In a house where silence had become survival, any shift in rhythm was loud. Evan started catching the alpha in doorways, at the edge of the staircase, in the shadows of corridors. Adrian did not forbid the children's closeness. He did not encourage it. He simply tightened. His posture became more rigid. His scent grew sharper, colder, like steel left out in winter air. His eyes followed Evan with something that wasn't desire and wasn't kindness. It was a haunted recognition, the look of a man watching the tide come in, knowing it could drown him if he stepped too far forward. Evan began to understand the real danger, not the children, not even his own unstable suppressants. The danger was Adrian's gaze, because it carried a question grief refused to let die. Why did this Omega smell like someone the house had buried, and what would it cost them all if that question ever demanded an answer? Adrian Hale ran his household like a man holding a lid down on boiling water. Everything moved according to rules that were never spoken loudly, because loudness itself felt like a threat. Doors closed softly. Footsteps stayed measured. Staff communicated in glances and short notes, as if the wrong sound might crack the architecture of control that kept the house standing. Evan learned Adrian's patterns the way he learned the rest of the estate, by watching, by listening, by memorizing the rhythm so he would never be the thing that disrupted it. The Alpha woke before dawn, when the windows still held darkness and the lake outside was only a flat sheet of black. He made coffee in the study with the blinds half closed, as if morning light had to earn permission to enter. He sat at the same desk, shoulders square, posture too rigid for someone alone. His tablet lit his face in a pale glow while he checked schedules, reports, messages from the city. Work was his language. Work was the only place grief couldn't reach him without permission. He left for the city without looking toward the sideboard, where nothing sat. Evan noticed the absence more than the presence. No framed photos in the foyer, no candid images on the stairs, no small signs of a partner's habits, like a forgotten scarf or a book left open. It was as if the dead had been folded away into drawers and sealed with careful hands. Adrian returned late, often after the children were asleep. He walked the halls once, every night, like a guard making a circuit. He paused outside Nora's door. He paused outside Leo's door. He never went in unless something forced him. Evan could hear the brief stop in Adrian's breathing on the other side of the wood, as if the Alpha wanted to step through and couldn't. Then Adrian would continue down the hall, the same route, the same pace, checking that nothing had changed, but things had changed. Evan was there, and Evan's scent, however carefully suppressed, moved through the house like a key sliding into an old lock. It didn't announce itself. It didn't bloom like heat. It simply existed in the air the way familiarity existed, quietly and persistently, until the body noticed. Adrian noticed. At first, he responded by tightening everything. Mealtimes became sharper. The children's routines were reinforced. The house physician's visits became more frequent. A new set of rules appeared on the staff board in the service hallway, typed and posted without explanation. The language was neutral, but Evan recognized the impulse behind it. When Adrian feared something, he didn't confront it emotionally. He built a system around it. The first real fracture happened on a Tuesday evening, when the sky had already turned the color of steel and the house lights made long reflections on the polished floors. Evan had set the dining table with the precision the house demanded, plates aligned, cutlery placed exactly, water glasses filled and wiped of fingerprints. He was adjusting a napkin when Adrian stepped into the kitchen doorway, likely expecting the room to be empty. The Alpha paused. It was small, almost nothing, but Evan saw it the way prey saw the shift of a predator's weight. Adrian inhaled once, shallow and controlled, then went still. His shoulders tightened, his jaw set. His eyes flickered as if he'd been struck by a memory too sharp to hold inside a body. Evan's own instincts flared. He kept his hands moving. He focused on the plates, on the cutlery, on anything that wasn't the sudden charge in the air. The house seemed to hold its breath around that single inhale. Adrian took one step forward, then stopped again. His gaze landed on Evan's wrist, where the sleeve had slid back just enough to show skin. Not because the skin was enticing, because scent and skin belonged to a story Adrian didn't want reopened. A short sound escaped Adrian, not a word, more like the beginning of one that he swallowed. His throat moved, his eyes darkened, not with hunger, but with grief that had nowhere to go. Evan kept his voice low, careful. "Dinner's ready." Adrian didn't answer. He turned away without eating. The movement was controlled, but the control looked strained, as if leaving the room took effort. A minute later, Evan heard a door close somewhere upstairs, harder than the house's usual quiet allowed. The sound traveled through the estate like a warning. That night, Evan found a new box of suppressants on his dresser. Higher grade than anything he could afford. Sealed, unopened. A note from the physician indicated a revised dosage schedule, typed in the same careful font as the staff rules. No greeting, no concern, just instructions. Evan understood immediately what it meant. It wasn't care, it was containment. Adrian was trying to manage the problem the way he managed everything, with resources, with rules, with control. Evan followed the new schedule because he needed the job and because the children were already orbiting him in a way that felt fragile. He couldn't afford to become a destabilizing force. He applied the patch, swallowed the stabilizers, drank more water, avoided triggering foods, avoided corners of the house where the old scent lingered strongest. But suppressants weren't magic. They were chemistry. And chemistry could only do so much against biology and memory. Over the next weeks, the children's attachment deepened in quiet, measurable ways. Nora began refusing sleep unless Evan's footsteps had passed her doorway at least once. Leo stopped eating unless Evan sat at the table, even if Evan ate nothing. Teachers noted improvements in focus, in mood, in the small social risks children took when they felt safe. The house, from the outside, started to look healthier. As if it was healing, Adrian did not look healed. He looked like someone being forced to watch his wounds close over a foreign object. He began staying home more often, claiming work could be done remotely. His presence changed the air. He hovered in doorways, on the edge of rooms, silent and watchful. Evan could feel him even when he didn't speak, like heat at the back of the neck. Not predatory heat, vigilant heat. The kind that came from a man who didn't trust himself. Sometimes Evan caught Adrian staring at him in the reflection of a window. The alpha's eyes didn't carry hunger. They carried a question that hurt to hold. Why did he smell like him? Evan started to suspect the job listing hadn't been an accident. Someone had noticed the scent match. Someone had decided to gamble with it. Perhaps the physician had seen the data from the agency screening. Perhaps the agency had placed Evan here deliberately, hoping it would soothe the children, stabilize the household, keep Adrian functional. Evan wasn't sure whether to be angry or afraid. Anger meant admitting he had been used. Fear meant admitting he might be trapped. One evening, as Evan cleared the table, he heard Adrian's footsteps in the hall and felt the children go still before the alpha even entered. Nora's shoulders rose. Leo's hands tightened around his fork. They were not afraid of Adrian in the way children feared violence. They were afraid of his tension, afraid of the invisible pressure that made their bodies brace. Adrian stepped in, looked at his children, then looked at Evan. His gaze lingered for a second longer than necessary. The alpha's scent sharpened, then pulled back, as if he had caught himself reaching for something he wasn't allowed to want. Adrian's voice came out rougher than usual, stripped of polish for half a heartbeat. "This is not supposed to be happening." Evan didn't respond. He only continued clearing plates, because if he acknowledged the sentence, it would become real. It would become a door opening. Later, alone in his room, Evan sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the estate's quiet. Somewhere a floorboard creaked. Somewhere a child sighed in sleep. Somewhere, far down the corridor, Adrian moved like a man pacing the edge of a memory he refused to enter. Evan understood one thing with chilling clarity. The house had been built around one man's loss. And the closer the house came to breathing again, the more violently that loss would demand to be acknowledged. It happened in the most ordinary way, the kind of moment that should have stayed small. Evan was doing what he always did when his nerves got too loud, cleaning, organizing, turning chaos into lines and stacks. The hallway closet was narrow and deep, packed with winter coats that still held the sharp scent of cold air. Some belonged to the children, smaller and brighter. Some belonged to Adrian, heavy and dark, cut to look like armor. Evan worked slowly, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. In this house, objects felt watched, as if each item had been placed with intention, and moving it might trigger something that had been kept quiet for a reason. He sorted by size, by fabric, by use. Gloves in one bin, scarves folded into another. The routine calmed him, a simple logic that didn't ask emotional questions. At the bottom of the closet, beneath a shelf of shoe polish and spare hangers, there was a small built-in drawer. It looked like the kind of drawer meant for keys or mail, a place for household clutter. Evan pulled it open to check for forgotten items, but it stuck halfway. He tried again, gentle at first, then firmer. The wood resisted, swollen with age and humidity. He tugged too hard. Something slid forward with a soft thud, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to make Evan's stomach tighten. A wrapped object emerged from the drawer like a secret forced into daylight, cloth, pale and carefully folded around a rectangular shape. The wrapping looked deliberate, protective, the way people wrapped something fragile they couldn't throw away. Evan should have put it back without looking. He knew that. Every rule he had learned in wealthy households told him to pretend he never saw it. Privacy was sacred here. Boundaries were survival. He reached to push it back into the drawer, but the cloth had loosened at the corner, just enough for a sliver of glossy paper to show through. A corner of a photograph, a curve of a smile. It felt unreasonably familiar. Evan's fingers hesitated. His pulse ticked faster, not from curiosity, but from the way his body reacted before he gave it permission. The scent in the closet shifted, faint but undeniable, rising from the cloth like a memory exhaling. Cedar. Warm linen. Winter smoke. His glands prickled, sharp and confused, as if they had been called by a signal they recognized but couldn't explain. Evan's hands moved on their own. He peeled the cloth back just enough to see the image beneath. The man in the photograph was an Omega, tall, slender, with warm eyes that looked like they had once held the whole house steady without forcing it. His posture carried a calm confidence, not loud, not performative, but grounded in the kind of quiet strength that made others soften around him. He stood beside Adrian, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. One hand rested on Adrian's forearm, not possessive, not decorative, but steadying, as if reminding the alpha that he didn't have to hold everything alone. The resemblance wasn't in the face. Evan did not share the same jawline, the same nose, the same exact features. It was worse than that. It was the softness of the expression, the angle of the neck. The way the Omega's presence seemed to make the air around him gentler, like a room after someone opened a window. Evan inhaled and felt his stomach drop. The scent. Even trapped in paper and old fabric, it was the same. The source of the house's ghost. The scent that lived in curtains and upholstery and hallways. This was the person Adrian had buried. Evan's throat tightened. He stared at the photograph longer than he meant to, as if his eyes could solve the mystery his body had already understood. So this was why the children looked at him the way they did. So this was why Adrian's composure cracked when Evan entered a room. Evan wasn't just new. Evan was an echo, close enough to hurt. Behind him, small footsteps sounded on the hardwood. Evan turned too late. Nora stood in the hallway, rabbit clutched to her chest, her face going still the moment she saw the frame in Evan's hands. Her eyes filled instantly, not with fresh sadness, but with something older, something stored up and locked down until it had nowhere left to go. A second later, Leo appeared behind her. He saw the photo, and his skin went pale. His small body tensed as if bracing for impact, as if the sight itself could strike him. For a moment, nobody moved. The air in the narrow hallway felt too tight to breathe. Evan's hands shook. He set the frame down carefully on the closet shelf, like it might shatter the moment it touched wood. He rewrapped the cloth as best he could, but his fingers fumbled with the fabric, his body too aware of the children staring. Nora didn't step closer. She didn't reach for it. She only stared, lips trembling. Leo didn't cry. He just stared with the rigid stillness of a child who had learned that showing emotion could make adults do unpredictable things. That was the first time Evan realized the truth with full clarity. He wasn't just similar. He was close enough that their grief had latched onto him like a life raft. Nora made a sound, small and broken, the kind of sound that came from the place before language. "That's him," Leo's voice came out thin, almost angry, like fear disguised as accusation. "Why are you here?" Evan felt his chest tighten so hard it hurt. He had no answer that could make sense to them. He didn't even have an answer that made sense to himself. "I didn't know," he managed, and hated how weak it sounded. The children stood frozen, caught between wanting to remember and wanting to survive. Their eyes kept flicking from the photograph to Evan as if their minds were trying to force the two images to align, as if they were asking the same impossible question Adrian's eyes had been asking. Footsteps sounded from the far end of the corridor. Heavier, slower, controlled. Adrian appeared and stopped the moment he saw them. He didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He simply went still, and his face emptied out as if every emotion had been yanked away at once. His gaze landed on the wrapped frame, then on Nora, then on Leo, then on Evan. The silence stretched until it felt cruel. Evan expected punishment, dismissal, a cold command to leave the house immediately. He felt his body brace for it. Adrian moved forward instead, careful as if approaching something explosive. He took the frame from the shelf with hands that did not look steady, though his posture tried to pretend they were. He unwrapped just enough to see the photograph. His eyes fixed on the Omega's face in the picture, and something in his throat worked like he was swallowing glass. He stared for a long time. Then, he set the frame back down, wrapping it again with a tenderness that made Evan's stomach twist. Adrian's fingers lingered on the wood, trembling in a way he would never allow anyone to see under normal circumstances. His scent shifted, subtle but unmistakably pained. It cut through Evan's suppressants like a blade, sharp enough to make Evan's glands flare in a reflexive response. Not attraction, not heat, a compulsion to soothe, to fix, to stabilize, the Omega instinct to reach for the wounded. Evan didn't move. He kept his distance because he understood the danger of misreading this moment. Adrian lifted his gaze to Evan, and in his eyes was something terrifyingly human. Confusion. Rage at fate and raw helplessness, the kind that came from needing something he did not want to need. His voice came out low, almost hoarse. Put it back. It wasn't an order meant to punish. It was a plea disguised as control. Evan nodded once and obeyed, hands careful, breath tight. That night the children slept poorly. The photograph had reopened a door their minds had nailed shut. Nora woke crying, shaking, calling for someone who wasn't there, and only calmed when Evan sat near her bed and kept his presence steady. Leo woke with wide, glassy eyes and refused to lie down until Evan stood in the doorway long enough for his breathing to slow. Adrian did not sleep at all. Evan saw him in the hallway at 3 a.m, standing motionless near the children's rooms like a guard who no longer remembered what he was guarding against. His shoulders were rigid. His face was calm in the way people looked when they were trying not to fall apart. The photograph had changed everything. It had made the ghost visible, and once a ghost had a shape, it demanded a reckoning. After the photograph, Evan tried to shrink into the safest version of himself. He tightened every habit until it felt like a discipline. He doubled his suppressant routine, drank water until his stomach sloshed, and avoided the rooms where the house's old scent lived strongest. He kept his voice even, his face neutral, his routines flawless. He stopped lingering in the hallways. He stopped letting Nora drift close enough to press her cheek to his sleeve. He stopped meeting Leo's gaze for too long, because Leo watched eyes the way other children watch storms. He told himself he could do the job without becoming the replacement everyone's grief wanted. He told himself it would pass, that the children's imprinting would soften if he stayed consistent but distant, that Adrian's tension would settle if Evan gave him nothing to react to. But biology was not obedient. It did not care about contracts or pride. The higher dosage dulled Evan's edges and sharpened his nausea. Some mornings he woke with a bitter taste in his mouth and a faint tremor in his hands. His glands ached in a way that felt wrong, like skin rubbed raw under a bandage. Stress made suppressants less stable, and suppressants made stress harder to hide. The loop tightened day by day. One afternoon, the house felt warmer than it should have. Not from the heaters, but from some subtle shift in the air, the kind Evan's body noticed before his mind named it. His stomach rolled. A thin sting flared at his glands, sudden and sharp, as if the suppressant barrier had slipped a fraction. He excused himself from the kitchen with practiced calm. He climbed the main staircase because the service stairs were busy, and halfway up his legs went weak. His fingers clamped around the banister. The world tilted. Not dramatically, but enough that the hallway lights smeared at the edges of his vision. He breathed through it, slow and controlled, the way he had learned to do in cramped apartments and crowded buses when panic and weakness tried to turn him into a scene. Then he felt it. His scent, muted but present, slipping into the air like a secret escaping. not a full omega bloom, not heat, but the underlying note suppressants normally kept buried: clean skin, warm salt. Something softer beneath, exposed by instability. Adrian appeared at the bottom of the stairs like he had been pulled by instinct. He froze the moment he inhaled. His face went hard. His breathing changed. The Alpha's pupils narrowed, then widened, as if his body had recognized something his mind refused to accept. He did not step forward, but the entire house seemed to tense around him, staff noise fading, air turning dense. Evan felt the pull immediately, the reflexive omega response to an Alpha's attention, amplified by weakness and fear. His stomach tightened. His glands throbbed. He hated it with a clean, cold anger. He hated that his body could be summoned by someone else's biology like that, hated that grief could turn him into a trigger without his consent. He forced himself upright and continued up the stairs, each step deliberate, as if willpower could stitch the suppressant barrier back into place. He did not look down. He did not give Adrian the dignity of being witnessed in that fracture. In his room, Evan locked the door and pressed his forehead to the wood. His breath came shallow at first, then steadier. He peeled back his sleeve and checked the patch, pressing it down harder, as if pressure could make it work. He splashed cold water on his face, watched his own eyes in the mirror, and saw a version of himself he disliked. Pale, shaken, too human. A knock came later, not aggressive, not gentle, not controlled. When the door opened, it was the house physician, carrying a case with the quiet efficiency of someone sent to manage a risk. He checked Evan's pulse, his temperature, the skin under the patch. He adjusted the dosage with quick hands and cooler eyes. The questions were clinical, clipped, designed to produce data. Evan answered because refusing would only tighten the cage. Before leaving, the physician offered one brief sentence, the closest thing to warning Evan had received in days. "You cannot afford instability here." Evan swallowed the reply that rose in his throat. Neither could the house, apparently. That evening, Adrian did not come to dinner. The children asked for him in careful voices that pretended they did not care. Staff offered vague excuses: work call, late meeting, not feeling well. The words sounded rehearsed, as if everyone had agreed to protect the Alpha from being spoken into visibility. Nora's shoulders dipped, disappointment settling like a familiar coat. Leo went quiet in the way he did when hope felt dangerous. Evan watched both of them and felt guilt rise in a slow, sick wave. He was not meant to be the anchor. He was meant to be an employee. And yet the house was rearranging itself around him anyway, bending routines to accommodate the children's reliance, bending silence to accommodate Adrian's tension. Later that night, Evan sat on the edge of his bed with his hands folded, waiting for the nausea to loosen. He heard footsteps in the hall and knew who they belonged to before the shadow stopped outside his door. Adrian did not knock. He did not enter. He stood there, close enough that Evan could feel his presence through the wood, tense like crossing the threshold would mean admitting something irreversible. Evan stayed still. He kept his gaze lowered, as if looking up could ignite the moment into something neither of them could control. Adrian's scent pressed into the crack beneath the door, pine and steel and restrained fury, layered with something raw underneath, something that felt like a bruise. A widowed Alpha's body did not forget its bond, and Evan's scent was close enough to scratch at that memory until it bled. Adrian's voice came out low, stripped of polish for a single heartbeat. "This is wrong." It was not accusation. It was confession. Evan did not answer. He could not fix grief with words. He could not unmatch a scent. He could not become less real. After a long stretch of silence, Adrian's footsteps retreated, controlled again, the lid forced back down over boiling water. In the days that followed, the household shifted, as if responding to an emergency protocol. Security tightened. The physician checked Evan more frequently. Staff began treating him not merely as an employee, but as a variable that affected the Alpha's stability. Doors closed faster when Adrian passed. Conversations stopped when Evan entered. Evan understood then that three forces in the house were converging: the children's imprinting, Adrian's unresolved bond, and his own unstable suppressants. He could keep obeying rules. He could keep making himself smaller. But he could not suppress what the house had already decided. He was no longer a stranger. He was a living trigger, and triggers always demanded a release. Weeks turned into months, and the children's bond with Evan stopped looking like ordinary affection. It wasn't a simple preference for a kind caretaker. It moved deeper into the place where a nervous system decided who meant safety. It happened too fast to be rational, too strong to be dismissed, built on the fragile scaffolding of scent memory and unmet longing. The children did not choose with logic. They chose with their bodies, with the instinct that had kept them alive through loss. Nora began bringing her breakfast to the small bench outside Evan's door. At first, she did it shyly, as if she expected to be corrected. A plate, balanced carefully, juice in a cup she gripped with both hands. She sat there even when Evan was in the kitchen, even when staff told her the dining room was ready. Sometimes Evan opened his door to find only crumbs and the worn rabbit left beside them like a guard. Sometimes he found Nora herself, knees tucked up, staring at the wood as if the door were a heartbeat she needed to hear. She did not always speak. She did not always cry. Her quietness felt more alarming than tears. It was the quiet of a child testing whether the world would allow her to hope without punishing her for it. Leo's attachment took a different shape. He did not cling. He shadowed. He began appearing in doorways when Evan moved through the house, silent and watchful. He followed at a distance that was close enough to matter, but far enough to pretend it didn't. If Evan went to the laundry room, Leo hovered at the threshold. If Evan crossed the foyer, Leo appeared near the staircase. If Evan sat in the sitting room to review schedules, Leo sat on the rug with a book he did not read, eyes flicking up every few seconds as if checking that Evan was still there. Evan could feel the child's nervous system calibrating in real time. Leo's breathing steadied when Evan was present, his shoulders lowered, his hands unclenched. The boy did not ask for comfort, but his body took it anyway, quietly, like water taken from a stream when no one was watching. Teachers reported improvements. Nora's attention sharpened, Leo's outbursts decreased, sleep improved, panic episodes softened in frequency and intensity. From a clinical perspective, Evan was stabilizing the children. The house staff started speaking about it in careful tones, as if naming the fact might make it disappear. From an emotional perspective, Evan was becoming the center of their world. Evan did not want that. He tried to keep boundaries intact, tried to redirect, tried to encourage Adrian's presence without pushing it. He built routines that included the alpha as often as possible. He invited the children to bring their questions to Adrian, guided them toward the father they still had. But the children's bodies resisted. They leaned into Evan's scent like it was warmth after months of cold. Adrian watched it happen like a man pinned under debris. He wanted his children safe. He wanted their grief eased. But every time Nora pressed closer to Evan, every time Leo followed Evan down a hallway, Adrian's own grief flared sharp and complicated. It smelled like jealousy and guilt braided together, impossible to rationalize. Not jealousy of Evan's attention, but jealousy of the ease. The way the children's bodies relaxed near Evan, while near Adrian, they stayed braced. The alpha did not scold them. He did not punish Evan. He simply tightened. He moved more carefully, spoke less, hovered more. The house's air changed whenever Adrian entered a room where Evan and the children were already settled. It became tense in a way children could feel immediately, the way animals felt a predator's attention before seeing it. Then the storm came. It started with wind that rattled branches against glass, and then a crack of thunder that shook the lake. Lights flickered once, twice, then died. The house dropped into sudden darkness, thick and unnatural. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the generators kicked in with a low hum, emergency lights glowing faintly in corridors like weak stars. The children's trauma responded before anyone could speak. Nora's breathing turned ragged. Her body began to shake, the tremor traveling through her small frame like electricity. Memory-triggered panic rose fast, as it often did after loss. She bolted from her room, bare feet slapping against floor, and ran straight to Evan without hesitation. She slammed into his side and clung, her fingers gripping fabric as if fabric could keep the world from collapsing. Her face pressed against his sweater, inhaling. Evan felt her take in his scent like medicine. The shaking eased by degrees, but her breath remained jagged, fragile. Leo followed, quieter, but just as urgent. He did not throw himself at Evan. He sat on the floor near Evan's feet, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the hallway as if expecting the darkness to open and swallow them. His hands clenched and unclenched, and his breathing stayed too fast until Evan shifted, lowering himself closer to Leo's level, making himself visible and steady. Evan gathered them into the only safe routine he had. He spoke in a consistent tone. He breathed slowly and audibly, letting the rhythm guide theirs. He kept movements predictable. No sudden gestures, no sharp commands. He began naming simple facts, grounding them in the present. "The generators are on," he said softly. "The house is safe." Nora's voice cracked in a whisper, raw and small. "Please don't leave." Evan's chest tightened. He swallowed, choosing words like stepping over broken glass. "I'm right here." The children's bodies softened. Nora's trembling eased into shivers. Leo's shoulders dropped a fraction. Their breaths lengthened, sinking to Evan's steady cadence. Adrian arrived in the doorway and stopped. In the dim emergency light, his face looked carved from restraint. His gaze locked onto the scene with painful clarity. His children clinging to Evan, soothed by Evan, held together by Evan. It was not a gentle tableau. It was a brutal truth. Something in Adrian shifted, not acceptance, not peace, a recognition that he was losing something he never meant to compete for. That grief had made him absent in the only language children trusted, and now they had chosen the first stable warmth they could find. Evan looked up and met Adrian's eyes. For a moment the house felt suspended between past and present, between memory and the living. Evan wasn't trying to take anyone's place, but he was in the place anyway, because the children had put him there. Adrian's voice came out low, stripped of polish. "Nora, Leo." The children did not move toward him. Nora only tightened her grip on Evan's sweater. Leo's gaze flicked to Adrian and back to the doorway, as if Adrian's presence increased tension instead of relieving it. Adrian's scent sharpened with pain, and the children's bodies responded, bracing again. Evan saw it and felt sick. Adrian's grief smelled like danger to them, not because Adrian was dangerous, but because grief had turned him into a constant pressure. Children read pressure as threat. When the storm passed and the light stabilized, Adrian began scheduling time with the children more deliberately. He tried to sit with them during meals, even when work calls stacked up. He tried to read at bedtime, voice controlled and careful. He tried to hold Nora when she cried, tried to place a hand on Leo's shoulder without making the boy flinch. But the children remained cautious around him. Their nervous systems could feel the tension in his muscles, the restraint in his touch. Even when Adrian wanted to comfort, he did it like a man afraid of breaking something. Children sensed fear as sharply as they sensed scent. They responded by tightening, by pulling back, by turning instinctively toward Evan's steadier calm. Evan found himself in the terrible middle. He could not encourage the children's dependence, but he could not withdraw without causing harm. The house physician's notes began mentioning attachment management. The therapist's recommendations arrived in measured language: gradual exposure, co-regulation, shared routines, slow expansion of safety from Evan to Adrian. No sudden separations, no forced closeness. Build trust like rebuilding bone. Evan tried to follow the plan, but the reality was messy. Some nights Nora accepted Adrian's presence only if Evan stayed in the doorway. Some mornings Leo ate only if Evan sat at the far end of the table, even while Adrian spoke gently nearby. The children were not rejecting their father out of cruelty. They were protecting themselves from the sensation of instability. It became clear this was not about replacing the dead. It was about building something new without shattering what was already fragile. But building something new required Adrian to acknowledge Evan as a person, not a problem to manage. And Adrian was still trapped between memory and the living, refusing to admit that he was beginning to need Evan too, not as a solution, but as a steady presence that the children's survival had already chosen. The master suite stayed off limits like a sacred room. Staff vacuumed the outer hall, dusted the picture rails, polished the brass sconces, but they never touched the door. It stood at the end of the upstairs corridor like a final boundary, the wood darker than the others, the handle wiped clean so often it gleamed. The key never left Adrian's ring. Evan noticed it because Adrian's hand moved to it whenever he passed that corridor, a small, unconscious check, like a man touching a scar to confirm it was still there. The boundary was maintained with almost religious discipline. It was not discussed. It did not need to be. In a house trained to silence, the most important rules were the ones everyone obeyed without being reminded. Evan respected it because it was not his place. He had already learned how grief lived here, how it sat under furniture and behind curtains. The master suite felt like the heart of that grief, sealed away so the rest of the house could function. Evan understood the logic. A closed door meant the past stayed contained, but the house itself did not respect the boundary. Old scent leaked from beneath the threshold on certain days, stronger when rain fell or heaters ran too warm. It drifted into the corridor in faint waves of cedar, warm linen, and smoke, the same signature that made Evan's glands prickle even under suppressants. It was a reminder that locked doors did not erase what lived behind them. They only delayed it. The children began to orbit that end of the hall without meaning to. Nora asked questions that Staff answered with gentle deflection. Leo watched the door in silence, gaze flicking to Adrian's key whenever the Alpha adjusted his ring. Curiosity wasn't the right word. It was hunger for evidence. Children wanted to confirm that what they remembered had been real, that the person they lost had not been a dream everyone was pretending not to mention. Grief had a way of leaking through locked doors. It seeped into dreams. It hid in routines. It turned forbidden rooms into magnets. One morning, Leo went missing. It happened in a window of time so ordinary it should have been safe. Breakfast had ended. Nora was upstairs brushing her hair. Staff moved between tasks. Evan was folding towels in the laundry alcove when he noticed the absence, not with sight but with instinct, the way he had learned to notice danger before it announced itself. The house felt wrong when Leo was not in it. He called the boy's name once, then twice, keeping his tone light so panic would not infect the air. There was no answer. A staff member checked the downstairs sitting room. Another checked the garden through the kitchen window. Adrian appeared in the hallway with his coat half on, the calm on his face too sharp, too forced. "Where is he?" It was a question, but it landed like a warning. Evan felt his stomach drop. 20 minutes was not a long time on paper. In a normal home, it meant a child had found a hiding spot. In a house shaped by loss, it was a lifetime. It was a replay of the day everything vanished. They searched quickly. The library, the pantry, the garden path by the lake. Evan checked behind curtains, under tables, in the small alcoves children loved because they felt hidden. Staff moved faster than usual, the quiet efficiency cracking into urgency. Adrian moved through the house with silent violence, opening doors too quickly, scanning corners, calling security by instinct as if danger had a name. Nora came running down the stairs, hair half brushed, eyes wide. "Leo?" Evan held up a hand to keep her back, not to exclude her, but to protect her from the panic in the air. Adrian did not speak to her. He could not. His focus narrowed into a single point, the way grief trained a body to do when it expected the worst. It was a house manager who found the clue, a small scuff mark on the runner rug leading toward the forbidden end of the upstairs hall. Evan felt cold spread through his chest as they followed it. The corridor was quieter there, the air heavier, as if sound didn't like to travel near that door. They found Leo sitting on the floor outside the master suite, back pressed against the wall. His knees were drawn up, his shoulders hunched. In his hands he held a small object like contraband, fingers wrapped around it as if letting go would mean losing something forever. A leather bracelet worn at the edges, softened by years of touch. The scent hit Evan before his mind caught up. Cedar, linen, smoke. Strong enough that his glands reacted despite suppressants, a sharp sting under his jaw that made him swallow hard. The bracelet smelled like the dead Omega in a way the house did not, concentrated and undeniable. Leo looked up at them with wet eyes and an expression too old for a child. His face was tight, not with mischief, but with grief made stubborn. He had the look of someone caught stealing oxygen. Adrian stopped so abruptly that the air seemed to snap. His gaze locked onto the bracelet. For a heartbeat, his face went blank, as if his mind had refused to process what his body already knew. Evan did not move closer. He watched because he understood. Leo had not broken rules to be naughty. He had followed scent the way his nervous system had learned to. He was searching for something that felt like home. And in this house, home had two scents now, one locked behind a door and one living under Evan's skin. Leo's voice came out small and hoarse. "I just wanted to remember." Adrian's breathing hitched once. Then he crossed the corridor in 2 silent steps and crouched, not fully lowering himself, not fully meeting the child's level, as if humility still hurt. He reached for the bracelet with careful fingers. Leo held on tighter for a second, a reflexive fear that taking it away meant taking the memory too. Nora made a small sound behind them, her hand rising to her mouth. Adrian's voice was low, tight with something close to breaking. "Leo, give it to me." Leo's fingers loosened slowly, like surrender. When the bracelet finally slid into Adrian's hand, Adrian's grip closed around it so hard his knuckles whitened. His face stayed composed, but his scent flared in a sudden wave. Pain, anger, fear, not at Leo, at the universe, at himself, at the fact that grief could still be stolen out of a drawer by a child who should not have to beg for memory. For a moment, Adrian looked like he might throw the bracelet back into the sealed room and lock the door forever. Then, his shoulders trembled once, almost imperceptibly, and he pressed the bracelet against his palm, as if grounding himself with it. Evan's stomach tightened because he saw the trap in real time. The master suite had been Adrian's attempt to keep loss contained, but Leo had already proven that containment did not heal. It only made the children search in secret. Adrian rose, still holding the bracelet. He did not speak to Evan, but his eyes flicked toward him briefly, sharp and accusing in a way that was not fair, as if Evan's presence had shifted the house into motion and now everything buried was being pulled up. That afternoon the household moved differently. Staff walked quieter again, as if noise could provoke the sealed door. Nora stayed close to Evan, her hand brushing his sleeve when she passed, as if checking that he was real. Leo stayed near the staircase, gaze blank, exhausted by the emotional labor of searching. That night, Adrian finally opened the master suite, not for himself alone, for the therapist, the physician, and the necessary process of making grief visible without letting it destroy them. Evan heard the click of the lock from down the hall and felt the entire house inhale. He was not invited. He was not meant to see inside, but he could imagine it. A room preserved too carefully, clothes that still held scent, a pillow that still held the shape of a head no longer there. Objects arranged like a shrine, untouched because touching meant admitting change. The therapist's voice was low behind the closed door. The physician's tone stayed clinical. Names were spoken, soft but firm, pulling the dead out of silence and into language again. Evan caught fragments through the wall, not words, but the cadence of a process, cataloging items, discussing memory triggers, planning gradual integration for the children, making the past part of the house instead of a sealed threat. When the meeting ended, staff drifted away. The door remained closed, but the corridor smelled different now, like dust disturbed, like fabric aired out, like old love scraped raw. Later, after the children finally slept, Evan heard footsteps outside his room. They stopped and did not move on. He sat up slowly, heart tightening, and listened. Adrian stood in the hall outside Evan's door and didn't leave. The alpha smelled like the master suite, like memories disturbed. The scent carried grief in layers, and beneath it a quiet exhaustion so deep it felt dangerous. Evan could feel Adrian's restraint failing, not as aggression, but as the slow collapse of a man who had held grief like a weapon for too long until it turned inward. Adrian didn't knock. He didn't enter. He simply stood there for several minutes, breathing, as if deciding whether to allow himself to lean on something alive. Evan stayed still. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't beg. He didn't push. He let Adrian have the dignity of choosing his own breaking point. When Adrian finally walked away, his steps were controlled again, but the control sounded thinner. Evan lay back down and understood something crucial. The locked suite had been Adrian's way of keeping the dead Omega contained, safe from change. But now change was in the house, wearing a similar scent, and the seal could not hold. The house had opened the door. And once that door opened, the past would no longer be a silent photograph. It would become a force that demanded either denial or transformation. The tipping point did not come from romance. It came from biology, the one truth the house could not negotiate with. Evan's suppressants began failing more frequently, not because he was careless, but because stress had quietly altered his baseline. The children's reliance was constant, a low hum of need that never fully turned off. Adrian's tension sat in every corridor like pressure in the walls. The staff's invisible expectations shaped Evan's movements until even resting felt like breaking a rule. Omegas were not machines. Evan's body was beginning to push back against being treated like one. It started with small signals that were easy to dismiss if someone wanted to. A faint sting at the glands when he passed the sealed end of the hall. A sudden warmth rising under his skin when Adrian entered a room. A nausea that came and went like tide, leaving him pale and sweating for no clear reason. Then, the sharper moments. A brief scent slip that made a staff member pause and inhale, eyes narrowing. A dizzy wave that forced Evan to grip a countertop until his vision stopped tilting. The physician adjusted doses, added stabilizers, recommended rest, spoke in clinical terms meant to keep the situation contained. But rest in that house was impossible. Evan could lie down and still hear a child's breathing through the monitor. He could close his eyes and still feel the weight of Adrian's presence somewhere beyond his door, the house itself holding its breath whenever the Alpha moved. Even when the rooms were quiet, Evan's nervous system stayed awake. The evening it finally broke into the open began with something small and ordinary, an old news clip. A staff member had left a screen playing in the kitchen, sound low, images rolling as background noise. Evan walked in carrying folded laundry and saw a familiar face flash across the display before he could turn away. The deceased Omega, caught in a candid frame beside Adrian, smiling as if the world was still safe. The clip was brief, almost harmless in length, but grief did not measure harm by time, it measured it by impact. Nora appeared at the doorway and froze. Her body reacted before her mind could. Her breathing hitched once, then again. Her shoulders rose as if bracing for something that had already happened. Her eyes widened, glassy with recognition that felt too big for her. The rabbit slipped from her fingers onto the tile. She made a sound that wasn't a word. Then, her chest began to move too fast, too shallow. Hyperventilation, shaking. The quick spiral of a nervous system that had never truly believed the past would stay buried. Evan moved immediately, not with panic, but with practiced urgency. He turned the screen off without slamming anything, as if quiet could keep her from shattering further. He lowered himself to Nora's height, keeping his posture open, keeping his scent as controlled as he could. He didn't grab her. He didn't crowd her. He did what the therapist had taught them all, what Evan had learned through necessity. He grounded her with consistency. He named what was real: the floor, the air, the room, the present. "Breathe with me," he said, voice steady. "Slow. You're safe." Nora's hands fumbled for his sleeve, clinging without thinking. Her breath came in harsh bursts at first, then began to follow his rhythm in uneven steps. Evan kept his tone calm, kept his movements predictable. When her shaking eased into smaller tremors, she leaned into his chest with the exhausted surrender of a child who had fought her own body and lost. Leo arrived silently and stood in the doorway, face tight, eyes scanning Nora for danger. His hands were clenched, his jaw set like he was holding himself together by force. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He watched Evan and Nora like the scene confirmed something he feared and something he needed at the same time. Adrian arrived last. He stepped into the doorway and stopped. His gaze locked on Nora curled into Evan's arms, quiet now, safe now, her breath finally steady. The Alpha's face tightened in an expression that could have looked like anger to someone who didn't understand scent, but Evan could smell it. Shame. Shame braided with helplessness. Shame that his child's body found safety in someone else's arms. Shame that his own grief still leaked into the house like smoke. Shame that he had tried to solve the problem with rules instead of presence. Adrian didn't speak. He didn't step forward. He watched his child settle against Evan like a small animal finding warmth. The room felt too full of unspoken truths. After Nora fell asleep later, curled on her bed with the rabbit held tight, Adrian finally confronted the reality he had been circling for months. He did it without drama, without speeches, like a man stepping into cold water because the heat had become unbearable. He met Evan in the hallway outside the children's rooms, where the light was low and the house listened. Adrian's voice came out rough, stripped down. "You're not a tool." The sentence landed heavier than apology because it admitted the shape of what had been happening. Evan's throat tightened. He had wanted to hear that and had been terrified of hearing it at the same time, because if Adrian acknowledged his humanity, then Evan could no longer hide behind the role of employee. He would become real in the story of the house, and being real meant being vulnerable to loss. Evan swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. Then stop treating me like one. For a moment, Adrian's composure wavered. His scent shifted, not toward dominance, not toward hunger, but toward something rawer and more dangerous, confession without speech. A widowed alpha's bond did not vanish just because the mate was gone. It stayed in the body like a scar that reacted to weather. Evan felt the pull of it and hated the world for how unfair it was. He didn't want to be compared to a dead man. He didn't want to wear someone else's memory like a uniform. He wanted to exist as Evan, with his own fears, his own limits, his own quiet strengths. The next day, the therapist outlined a plan with clear, careful language. Less reliance on Evan as sole regulator, more shared routines with Adrian present, gentle transition rather than sudden removal. The goal was not to erase Evan's role. It was to distribute safety so the children could survive change without catastrophe. Adrian complied. For the first time, he didn't treat the plan as an enemy. He treated it as responsibility. Evan noticed the shift in small, almost invisible ways. Adrian sat on the floor with the children instead of standing above them. He let them approach rather than reaching for them. He breathed through his own discomfort instead of tightening his shoulders and sharpening his scent. When Nora started to panic, Adrian stayed in the room and did not retreat, even when his face went pale with the effort of holding himself steady, and Evan began to step out in short intervals. Not dramatic departures, just minutes, a trip to the kitchen, a walk down the hall, a pause outside the room while Adrian stayed inside with the children. Each time Evan left, he listened for the sound of catastrophe. It did not come. The children wobbled. They breathed fast. They looked toward the door. But Adrian stayed present. He did not force closeness. He did not demand affection. He simply held the space, calm enough to be tolerable, steady enough to be learned. It was progress. It was also painful, because as Adrian learned to be present, Evan began to feel something else, something he had worked hard not to feel. Belonging, not because he was replacing the dead Omega, but because in the quiet labor of care, Evan had become part of the house's living architecture. The children knew his footsteps. Staff adjusted schedules around him without thinking. Even the air in the corridors seemed to settle when he was near. And the more Evan belonged, the more dangerous it became to remain unlabeled. Staff whispers started in the service hallway, quiet and cautious, but real. Outsiders began noticing the children's attachment during rare public outings. The estate's public image had been built around a widowed alpha, holding his family together with controlled dignity. A new Omega presence threatened that story. Evan was not a replacement, but the world did not care about nuance. The world loved simple narratives, ghost and substitute, scandal and temptation, tragedy and betrayal. Simple narratives were already circling the house like vultures, and soon they would collide with the truth. The scandal started the way scandals always did in wealthy households, through a leak disguised as concern. It arrived on a quiet morning, packaged as something gentle. A lifestyle outlet published a soft piece about Adrian Hale's quiet strength after loss, the kind of article written to look respectful while still feeding the public's appetite. The headline was sympathetic. The tone was warm. The photographs were tasteful at first glance. The estate was shown from a distance, the lake and pines framed like a painting. The image was blurry enough to feel polite, but sharp enough to make it clear someone had been watching. Someone had stood on a public road or a distant hill with a long lens and waited for the right angle. Privacy had already been punctured. The article simply made the puncture public. It described Adrian as disciplined, dignified, steady. It mentioned his children and the tragedy of their Omega parents' death with carefully chosen words, the kind designed to evoke emotion without liability. It praised Adrian's commitment to stability, his refusal to let grief fracture his family, his ability to keep the household quiet despite the storm beneath it. Then came the line that changed everything. A rumor wrapped in polite language, a suggestion framed as worry. A quote from a source close to the family, claiming that a live-in Omega caretaker had taken over the household, that the children were confused, that Adrian was emotionally compromised. The sentence was short, almost casual, placed like a hook in the middle of sympathy. Evan read it on a tablet in the service corridor and felt his stomach drop so hard it seemed to pull the rest of him with it. He reread the line twice, not because he didn't understand, but because part of him still believed the world couldn't be so cruel with such ease. Of course it could. The story spread faster than anyone could contain, not because it was accurate, but because it was perfect bait. A widowed alpha, a mysterious omega, children caught in the middle. Society loved turning grief into entertainment, loved boiling complex pain down into a simple scandal that fit into a headline. Within hours, the article had been reposted, summarized, exaggerated. Commentators who had never set foot inside the house began writing certainty as if it were fact. The narrative became binary almost immediately, the way public narratives always did when omegas were involved. Either Evan was a manipulative omega exploiting a grieving alpha, or Adrian was a weak alpha who had allowed himself to be seduced into shame. There was no room for anything human, no room for trauma, for attachment, for a child's nervous system choosing safety. No room for the possibility that grief could create strange alignments that were not moral failures. Security tightened overnight. Gates that had once looked decorative became active checkpoints. Staff were questioned one by one, voices low, faces tense. Phones were checked for unusual contacts. A new non-disclosure document appeared on the staff board, printed in heavy paper, signatures demanded by noon. Lawyers arrived in dark coats and colder expressions, carrying folders that smelled like power. A public relations team followed, moving through the house like surgeons assessing where to cut. Adrian's board associates called with thinly veiled threats disguised as professional concern: reputation, stability, investor confidence, optics. The words repeated until they felt like a chant. Evan felt the danger immediately. Omegas always paid first when stories turned ugly. He could already imagine strangers' opinions hardening into judgment. He could imagine the moral panic, the assumption that his body was inherently suspicious, inherently tempting, inherently at fault. Even inside the house, the air changed. Staff who had once treated him with careful neutrality now looked at him with a new edge. Not necessarily hatred, but fear. Fear of being associated, fear of scandal splashing onto their own lives. Fear made people cruel in small ways, and Evan had learned long ago that small cruelties added up like debt. The children felt it too, though they could not name it. They sensed the adults' tightened voices, the hurried footsteps, the way doors closed faster than usual. Nora became clingier, her small hand finding Evan's sleeve more often, as if she could physically prevent him from disappearing. Leo started checking locks, moving through the house with the alertness of a child who had already learned that safety could be taken away by forces he didn't understand. Their old trauma patterns resurfaced under the weight of adult anxiety. Adrian reacted with cold precision. He did not collapse. He did not rage publicly. He mobilized resources the way he always did when threatened. Lawyers drafted statements. The PR team outlined damage control. The plan appeared on paper with brutal simplicity. Remove Evan quietly. Restore the public narrative. Keep the children stable with therapy and time. Evan understood the logic. He even understood the temptation, a clean cut, a simple fix. Adrian's old pattern of control and containment offered itself like a familiar drug. If Evan left, the scandal lost its hook. The story could be rewritten as a misunderstanding. The household could return to the controlled silence it had once been built on. But Evan had lived through enough to know what quietly removed meant for an omega in a rich man's crisis. It meant being erased from the narrative with money and paperwork. It meant being blamed without ever being asked the truth. It meant being reduced again to a body that caused problems, a body that needed to be managed. He stood in the kitchen later that afternoon, stirring a pot he barely tasted, while the house hummed with quiet urgency. Nora sat at the table drawing, eyes flicking up every few seconds to check if Evan was still there. Leo leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, too watchful to be relaxed. The children were not just attached anymore. They were braced. Adrian entered without the usual stiffness. His face was controlled, but his eyes looked tired in a way Evan hadn't seen before. The Alpha held a printed copy of the article, paper folded into hard creases from being gripped too long. He set it down on the counter like it was something contaminated. Nora glanced at it, then at Adrian, then back at Evan. Her voice came out small. "Are you leaving?" The question sliced through the room with the clean violence only children could produce. It didn't accuse. It didn't manipulate. It simply revealed the fear underneath everything. Evan's throat tightened. He kept his voice steady because steadiness was the only gift he knew how to give. "Not right now." Leo's jaw clenched. "They always make people go." Adrian's hand flexed near the paper. His scent sharpened with something close to anger, then softened into something heavier. He looked at his children and saw what the public could not, the way their bodies responded to instability like a wound being reopened. If Evan disappeared abruptly, it wouldn't just hurt them, it would confirm their deepest fear. That warmth left, that love was temporary, that the world took what you needed and called it necessary. Adrian's gaze shifted to Evan. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence wasn't avoidance this time. It felt like a crossroads. Evan watched Adrian in those days and saw grief transform into something else. Not romance yet, not tenderness. Something more difficult. Responsibility that refused to hide behind reputation. Adrian's voice finally came out low, controlled, but real. "They don't get to decide what my children need." The sentence was simple, but it rewrote the air in the room. It was the first time Adrian had spoken against the world instead of rearranging himself to survive it. The PR team wanted statements, the lawyers wanted compliance, the board wanted distance. Every external force pulled toward the same conclusion. Inside the house, the children pulled toward something different. Evan was not a replacement. He was not a scandal. He was a person the children had chosen as safety, and a person Adrian had begun, painfully, to acknowledge as human. The house was about to choose, and the choice would define whether Evan was a temporary patch over a wound or someone with a place in a family that was finally learning to live again. The pressure peaked in a meeting that felt less like a family discussion and more like a negotiation over a living person. It was held in the estate's formal sitting room, the one designed for public-facing conversations. The furniture sat in perfect lines. The windows looked out over the lake like a staged backdrop. Even the air smelled controlled, filtered, too clean. Evan hated that room because it made grief look polite. Lawyers arrived first, coats still on, briefcases set down with the quiet confidence of people who never had to ask permission to take up space. The physician followed, expression neutral, carrying charts and notes that could be weaponized as easily as they could be used for care. The therapist sat with a folder of documentation, the only person in the room whose presence belonged to the children rather than the image of the household. Adrian's business representatives arrived last, faces smooth, voices soft, each word shaped to sound reasonable while pushing toward a single outcome. Evan was not invited as an equal. He was invited as a subject. They spoke about protecting the children, but the way they looked at Evan said they were protecting something else too. Reputation, stability, optics, the narrative of a widowed alpha who had endured tragedy with strength. The proposal was placed in front of Evan like a gift, polished, rational, and cruel in its simplicity. A generous settlement, relocation support, a confidentiality agreement thick enough to feel like a wall, a clean timeline. Evan would sign, disappear, and never be mentioned again. The children would be told a story that required no explanation. The caretaker moved on. Life continues. Adrian's public image would remain intact. Everything in the document was smooth. Every sentence made removal sound compassionate. Even the phrases about Evan's well-being felt like soft hands pushing him out of the house. Evan stared at the papers and felt his stomach drop. He could take the money. He could secure a life he had never been allowed to imagine. A safe apartment, reliable medication, a future where he did not count currency like calories. He could leave before the scandal sharpened further, before strangers' opinions turned into threats. He could walk away, and he could also see the consequences in his mind with painful clarity, because he had been watching the children long enough to understand their bodies better than most adults did. Nora's panic would return full force. Not immediately, not as a dramatic collapse. It would come at night, in the sudden tightness of her breathing, in the way storms made her tremble, in the way the smallest reminder of loss could throw her back into terror. The child had only begun to loosen her grip on the world. Removing Evan abruptly would snap it tight again. Leo's trust would collapse into permanent suspicion. He would interpret the departure as proof that attachment was a trick adults played before disappearing. His progress would turn into armor, his quietness into a sealed room of his own. He would learn to become unreachable, and Adrian's progress would snap back into grief-driven control. Evan had seen what happened when Adrian tried to survive without softness. The house would turn quiet again, but it would be the quiet of containment, not healing. Evan could sense the children's nervous systems like tuning forks. He knew they would not adjust quickly. They would break quietly and carry the break for decades. Across the table, Adrian listened to the proposal without expression. His face remained controlled, the lid held firmly down. But Evan could smell the shift in him, subtle and real. Not rage, not panic. Something colder at first, then something steadier, as if a decision was forming beneath the surface. Adrian's representative spoke about investor confidence, about board pressure, about the cost of scandal. They framed it as inevitability, the way powerful people did when they wanted compliance without appearing to demand it. The therapist tried to push back, carefully. She referenced documentation, assessments, measurable patterns. She spoke about attachment and trauma, about gradual transitions, about the risk of sudden severance. Her words were clinical, but the concern in her eyes was human. The lawyer slid the papers a fraction closer to Evan, a small gesture, a heavy one. Evan's fingers did not move. Adrian finally spoke, voice low, controlled. "What does the therapist's report say?" The question redirected the room, shifting it from optics to evidence. The therapist opened her folder and began outlining what she had documented. The children's reliance on Evan was not opportunistic, not manipulation, not confusion. It was a trauma response turning into a healing process. It was measurable in sleep patterns, panic frequency, school behavior, physiological regulation. It was visible in the way the children's bodies settled when Evan was present and tightened when stability threatened to vanish. Removing Evan abruptly would be harmful, not emotionally inconvenient. Harmful. The room grew tense. People argued about what was appropriate, about legacy, about how a widowed alpha should look, behave, recover. They used the dead Omega's memory like a shield, as if honoring the past required punishing the living. Evan sat there feeling his skin prickle, not from heat, but from the sharpness of being discussed like an object. He kept his posture still because any visible reaction could be turned into proof of Omega instability. Adrian's scent changed. The ice and steel of control gave way to something steadier, not anger, certainty. He looked at the documents in front of Evan as if seeing them for what they were. An attempt to seal another room, another locked door, another way of pretending grief could be managed by removing whatever triggered it. Adrian's voice cut through the room with quiet force. No relocation. The business representative's smile tightened. Adrian, the optics. Adrian lifted a hand, simple and final. "My children are not optics." The sentence landed like a shift in gravity. Evan felt it in his chest, a strange mix of relief and fear. Adrian turned the conversation toward what had been avoided for too long. "You want a clean story," he said. "But clean is not the same as safe." He proposed something messier and honest. Evan would remain as a consistent caregiver while the children's attachment was carefully redistributed. Not a secret, not a scandal, not a replacement, but a stable figure whose presence could not be erased without cost. Evan would have protected legal status as an essential attachment figure, a guardian role limited but real, built around the children's documented needs. Adrian would remain primary guardian. The therapist's plan would guide the transition rather than public opinion. The lawyers began to object. The representatives warned about consequences. Investors could pull support. Boards could tighten pressure. Society could gossip and sharpen narratives into weapons. Adrian accepted the cost without flinching. Let them. For Evan, the moment was both relief and terror. Staying meant belonging. Belonging meant visibility. Visibility meant being seen by a world that had always treated Omegas as disposable, suspicious, convenient. It also meant something Evan had never been offered cleanly: choice made in his favor without him having to bargain his body for it. The new legal documents were drafted with unusual language. Evan was recognized as an essential attachment figure. The dead Omega's role was acknowledged without being weaponized. The household structure was described as it actually existed rather than forced into a public-friendly mold. Evan signed with hands that trembled slightly, not from instability, but from the weight of what it meant. The children did not understand the paperwork. They understood only the atmosphere when Adrian returned home that evening. His control did not tighten, it softened into structure that included them. His voice sounded steadier. His presence felt less like a storm held inside a body and more like a wall they could lean against. Nora watched Evan for a long time and whispered, as if afraid the world might overhear. "You're staying." Evan swallowed, throat tight. "Yes." Leo didn't smile. He only exhaled, a small release that sounded like a lock turning open. In the quiet that followed, the house took its first real breath since the funeral. And in that breath, Evan felt something he had refused to name for months, not being wanted as a substitute, not being kept as a solution, but being chosen as himself. Time did not erase grief. It never did. The house kept its history the way old wood kept smoke, the way fabric kept perfume long after the wearer was gone. But time changed grief's shape when the living stopped treating it like a weapon. It softened edges. It made space. It allowed new routines to settle beside old pain without being swallowed by it. Months passed, and the estate became louder, not in chaos, not in disorder, just in life. Footsteps at breakfast that did not stop the moment Adrian entered the room, a child's laugh bursting out at the wrong moment and not being punished by silence, a door closing with ordinary care instead of reverence. Staff still moved efficiently, but the tension in their shoulders eased as if the house had finally given them permission to breathe. A dog appeared one afternoon as the most impulsive human decision the household had made in a long time. Leo had been quiet for days after a therapy session that dug into old fears, the kind of quiet that meant he was building walls again. Evan found him sitting on the back steps, staring at the lawn as if the horizon could explain abandonment. Adrian arrived home early, saw the boy's stillness, and did not retreat into work or control. He sat on the step beside Leo without forcing conversation. He stayed. When Leo finally whispered, thin and sharp, "Everything leaves," Adrian did not correct him with false comfort. He answered with the only thing that mattered. "Not everything," he said. The next day, a small dog with 2 large ears and nervous paws was brought to the estate under official adoption paperwork. The staff looked startled. The physician raised an eyebrow. The PR team would have hated it if they were still hovering. But Leo's hand softened the moment the dog pressed its head into his leg, and something inside the boy unclenched. The dog stayed. It became part of the household's therapy in motion. It slept outside Nora's door. It followed Evan into the kitchen. It learned Adrian's footsteps and stopped flinching at them. It made the house sound like a home, nails tapping on hardwood, quiet sighs in the evening. The hallway outside the master suite no longer felt like a haunted border. The door remained mostly closed, not erased, not disrespected, but integrated. The therapist helped them build rituals that made memory safe instead of explosive. Some days the children were allowed to bring a drawing inside and leave it on a shelf. Some days they talked about the deceased Omega parent in simple language at the breakfast table without the room turning cold. There were still moments when scent memory hit too hard, when Nora's face went pale and her fingers tightened around her rabbit, when Leo's jaw locked as if bracing for impact. But the house no longer responded by sealing everything away. It responded by staying present. Nora's nightmares still came sometimes, a sudden storm, a news clip, a scent trapped in an old scarf. She would wake, shaking, breath too fast, eyes wide with the old terror that told her safety was temporary. But the nightmares stopped controlling the nights. Evan learned to ground her without becoming her only anchor. Adrian learned to sit beside her bed and breathe slowly until her body matched his rhythm. Sometimes Nora pressed her face to Evan's sleeve. Sometimes she reached for Adrian's hand. The important change was that she could reach for either and still feel safe. Leo still tested people because that was how he protected himself from disappointment. He tested Evan less now, not because he trusted easily, but because he had already proven Evan stayed. He tested Adrian more, in small, relentless ways. He refused bedtime stories. He pretended he didn't care when Adrian came to school events. He tried to provoke impatience, because impatience would confirm Leo's belief that love had limits. Adrian learned to let the tests end in trust. He sat on the floor during playtime and let Leo decide how close to come. He stopped using his voice like a command and started using it like a presence. He learned to apologize without making the apology about his own pain. When Leo muttered, "You didn't notice I was gone," Adrian did not argue. He answered softly, "I noticed. I was terrified. And I'm sorry I ever let you feel alone." Evan remained consistent, but his role evolved. He was not only a caretaker anymore. He became a stable adult presence woven into daily life, someone the children could rely on, someone Adrian could coordinate with, rather than silently resist. They built shared routines by design, mornings where Adrian packed lunches while Evan handled uniforms, afternoons where Evan supervised homework while Adrian sat nearby, not forcing interaction, simply becoming part of the atmosphere of safety. The therapist called it co-regulation and distributed attachment. The children called it normal. The scent issue did not disappear. Evan still smelled close enough to the deceased Omega to stir memory, close enough to wake old instincts and old grief. But something important shifted. The house began to learn Evan's unique scent beneath the similarity. It was subtle at first, the difference between an echo and a voice. The children began to associate Evan not only with what they had lost, but with what they had gained: steadiness, warmth that stayed, a calm they could borrow when their own bodies panicked. Adrian changed too. He stopped treating Evan's scent as betrayal. He began treating it as complicated mercy, not a replacement for the dead, not a theft of memory, but a bridge between past and present, a reminder that love could exist again without erasing what came before. What grew between Adrian and Evan was not sudden passion. It was slow trust built through exhaustion and shared responsibility. It was late nights in the kitchen when the children finally slept and the dog had curled into a silent coma on the rug. Evan's hands moved automatically, rinsing cups, wiping counters, body still wired for vigilance. Adrian stood nearby, not hovering like surveillance anymore, but staying like partnership. Sometimes they spoke in short sentences about school schedules and therapy updates. Sometimes they said nothing at all, and the silence didn't feel like punishment. One night, Evan paused at the sink, shoulders tight, and whispered without looking up, "I don't want to be his shadow." Adrian's answer came quietly, steady as a hand on a railing. "Then don't be." Evan's throat tightened. The simplicity of being allowed to exist as himself felt almost unbearable. The outside world eventually got bored, as it always did. Scandals moved fast. Outrage needed fresh fuel. Adrian's team issued minimal statements and refused to feed the story. There were no dramatic interviews, no public confession, no spectacle. The narrative faded because it did not get the blood it wanted. Those who mattered learned the truth anyway. The household had chosen the children's well-being over public comfort. On a calm evening near the lake, Evan watched Nora and Leo run along the grass, the dog sprinting after them in clumsy joy. The air smelled like pine and water and something domestic, something warm. Adrian stood beside Evan, not tense, not braced, simply present. Their shoulders did not touch, but the space between them felt less like a boundary and more like a shared understanding. Evan realized he no longer felt like a borrowed body. He felt like a person with a place. Love after loss was never simple. It was never clean, but it could be honest. It could be built around the living without betraying the dead. If you stayed until the end, tell me in the comments whose struggle hit you hardest in this story. Evan, who refused to become a replacement; Adrian, who had to choose between image and a future; or the children, who learned to trust again. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next forbidden BL story of love.